So last week I preached a sermon, and everybody came to me and said, that was quite the sermon. It was on forgiveness, right? I was like, no. But it kind of was. It was on reconciliation with a sub-theme of forgiveness. So this week it's entirely different. It's on forgiveness with a sub-theme of reconciliation. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was a serial killer in the U.S. His name was Gary Ridgway, and he's doing time. He's about 68 now. He's alive in prison, life imprisonment in Washington State. And so it was calculated that he probably murdered about 90 women. He confessed to something like 70 of them, and he got convicted for over 40 of them, 49 of them, I think, something like this. So back in 2003, he was his sentencing, and when it came to before the sentencing, they have victim statements. It's called victims, but people could come and say what they thought to the judge before the sentencing. And so a lot of the family members of these women who had been killed came forward, and almost all of them. Like, actually, I had heard this story before, but I found it on YouTube last night. You can actually see this very dramatic courtroom scene live, the way it happened back in 2003, if you want to look at it up online. And the people that were coming forward were basically cursing this guy to his grave. They were basically, hell is too good for this guy. There's nothing we can say about him. We hope he suffers, and on and on. And finally, one of the fathers came forward, and his name was Robert Rule, which is a kind of interesting name, but Robert Rule. His daughter had been murdered by Ridgway when she was 16. Her name was Linda. And he came to the stand, and he's a big kind of Western-looking guy with he's got white hair and a big white beard, big kind of chunky guy, and he comes up, and there's a quiet. And to this point, by the way, you can see even in the video that while these people are cursing him to death, he's just totally unmoved. It's like he doesn't care as they speak. Then, so these are Rule's words to Ridgway. He says, "Mr. Ridgway, there are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe, and that is what God says to do, and that's to forgive. You are forgiven, sir." That's all he said. But these words brought Ridgway to tears. Hardened, wicked man, if you will. Another story I read a few years ago was the story of Immaculée Libagiza. She was a survivor of the Rwandan Holocaust, or genocide, I guess they call it. And she was on the wrong side of the tribes. Remember, there was a tribal. This is back in the 90s as well, and there was this tribal war between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And her family, they were all intermingled in the various communities and villages of Rwanda. And her family was very, everybody knew and loved them. Her parents were kind to everybody. They made no distinction between, and it was almost impossible to tell who was which tribe you came from. And the kids, Immaculée didn't even know there was a difference when she was going to school. She started to catch on when they started to get treated differently in classes in some of her grades. But she didn't know the difference. It's kind of, I was thinking, like, how do we know the difference between the tribes now, like in our communities? And the only thing we tend to maybe know is whether they're conservative or liberal, right? And then we can, and then we might treat each other weird. Hopefully not. But yeah, so basically, and I forget which way it is. I think it was the Hutus rose up. Basically, people sowed hatred in the hearts of their fellow tribespeople against the other tribe, and they just started killing. And people were slaughtered. There was at least 1 million people were slaughtered in this genocide. And many just with machetes, people raiding groups of young guys coming to your home. All her family, this Immaculée's family, were slaughtered, were killed. She was hidden away by a person of the other tribe in what had been, I think it was a washroom in the house. And they hid the door to the washroom by putting a big kind of shelving unit up against it, because people kept coming to the house to look for people. And she was in this teeny little, it was incredibly small, like it might have been 2 square meters or something like this, with about 5 or 6 other women from time to time. They were kept there for months. And so she survived the genocide. While our human nature desires revenge, Immaculée Libagiza chose, and she's a Christian, by the way, follower of Jesus, chose to forgive the people who killed her family as she felt the bitter feelings of rage destroying her. Though not easy, she was determined to let forgiveness rather than hate rule her life. Eventually, she met one of the murderers face to face of her family and told him directly that she forgave him. There's a lot of that was done, actually, post-genocide in Rwanda, just to bring healing to the land. And we know that a lot of that has happened in South Africa, too, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And a lot of that is starting to go on, things like that are starting to go on in the residential school situation that we've had in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there. So there's so much hurt and damage to people's lives that it calls for something like that. So Libagiza now lives in the U.S., and she wrote a book, a bestseller, which you can read, and it's called Left to Tell. Left to Tell. So basically, I mean, I think Robert Ruhle was right when he said to Ridgway, "You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe." And this forgiveness thing can be very, very difficult, very, very tough. Not an easy thing at all. So it's difficult, but it's true that it's necessary. And even the psychologists and the counselors nowadays that counsel people who have been through various traumas or various abuses, they will tell you the same, they will tell their clients the same thing, their patients, that you need to learn to forgive. I mean, it's tough, but this bitterness and the hatred that you have and the hurt that you have is going to eat you up if you don't. For your own sake, you need to forgive. And it's commonly used as therapy nowadays, forgiveness therapy, which is interesting. And that's a relatively new thing, I think, in the last, few generation or so. But Jesus was talking it up 2,000 years ago in a big way. I mean, he pioneered it, if you will. But now they're catching on to this thing that Jesus has been talking about. And in the ancient world where Jesus, when Jesus lived and the Bible was written, forgiveness was a rarity. They weren't real big on forgiveness. You ever read the Old Testament? Oh my goodness. The violence and the sword and the slaying and the slaughter and people tell me, I can't read that Old Testament. It's just so full of war and killing and violence. Yeah, because that's what that world was like. The wonder is, God's grace and God's intervention in lives, even in the midst of this, dog-eat-dog world of violence that was the Old Testament world, the ancient world. So we didn't read the story here, but in Lachlan, and I don't know about English because I didn't go there today, but in Lachlan we read also the story from Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter of Genesis, about Joseph receiving his brothers after his father died. So, I mean, they'd all arrived in Egypt where they were kept safe because there was famine where they used to be. And basically on account of Joseph being there and being the prime minister, if you recall, Pharaoh had put him in charge of the whole land. His brothers, to refresh you with the story, his brothers, so also in the Middle East, you understand that, families are super tight and super close and knit together, and they got each other's backs, except in this case. So Israel, also known as Jacob, had 12 sons, one of whom was Joseph. And 10 of the sons basically sold him into slavery. They were going to kill him, but some of the sons said, no, we better not do that. So instead, they sold him off as a slave to some slave traders, and then they told his father that he was dead. And then the slave traders went to Egypt and sold him again to a captain of the king's guard, and he worked for him for a while. Then the guy's wife accused him of trying to rape her, so he got thrown in prison, although he didn't do anything of the kind. And he stayed in prison for several years. So he's been abandoned by his family, sold out by his brothers, or everybody thinks he's dead. He's got nobody, and he's in prison. And long story short, God raises him up to be Pharaoh's right-hand guy, and he puts him in charge of the whole land. And so then eventually the Jacob's family, the rest of the brothers and such, come to Egypt to get help in time of famine. And they run into Joseph, who's in charge, but they don't recognize him. So, and he takes care of them. He plays with them a little bit if you read the story. There's several chapters in Genesis. It's a great novel. You should read it if you never have. So then when his father finally dies and they're all in Egypt, they're terrified that he's going to finally come down on their heads. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid." Oh no, but even before this, "Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So embedded in the world of violence and the ancient texts of our Old Testament is this incredible story of forgiveness. Incredible. And this is a story that Jesus was well aware of and well versed in. And this was a kind of forgiveness in which we also see God's sovereign hand at work in the lives of these people to protect them, even though in this horrible circumstance that they were in. So if anyone had the right not to forgive, it would be Joseph, but he did. And Jesus' story that Renee read today about the king is kind of the ultimate teaching about forgiveness. A pretty big chunk of this chapter, about half the chapter, is given over to this, 15 verses of a 35-verse chapter. To this, and this is a chapter that's all about, by the way, the church, the ecclesia, the gathering, and how we're to be with each other. And just to review that story, in case you weren't listening. So there's a king, and he brings up his servants, and they got to pay their debts because he's been lending them. And the one comes along who owes him, it says 10,000 talents. The reading at Lachlan was 10,000 bags of gold. So it's just this astronomical amount of money that he owes. It's like a king's ransom. It's like the national debt of the USA. It's so huge. And he can't pay, so he orders him to be sold along with all his family and all his possessions to pay the debt. And the guy throws himself at his mercy and he says, "Please forgive me and I will pay it back to you." So it says he forgave him his entire debt. He just had mercy on him and just let him off. And as he goes out, he meets a companion, a fellow servant, who owes him like a couple of $1,000. And he takes him by the throat and says, "Pay back what you owe me." And the guy says, "Have mercy on me, and I'll pay back all that I owe." It's exactly what he said to the king. Exactly. Word for word in the text. Deliberately, of course. And he says, "No, that's not good enough." And he throws him in jail till he will pay everything that he owes. I'm not sure how people pay when they're in jail, but anyway, that's part of the story that we don't have to worry about. And so then the fellow servants, they're ticked off. They say, "Look at what happened between the king and this guy, and then how this guy treated our other servant." So they go back to the king and say, this and such happened. So he calls them back up, and he says, "You wicked servant! I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to." Verse 33, chapter 18. "Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" That, my friends, is the climactic verse right there. Right? "Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured. Ben, was that not in? I didn't see that. Hear that in your eye skipped over that maybe. That's harsh. "Until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart." And that last little phrase there just gets slipped in, right? Unless you forgive your brother or your sister from your heart. Wow. This week, what does that actually mean, from the heart? To me, it strikes me as being a level or a degree of forgiveness that may be beyond what we usually do. Not just forgive from the heart. I don't know how many of you read The Observer. By the way, that's the United Church magazine, in case you guys don't know. The Observer. This is the past month's Observer. And there's an article in it. It says "Conundrums," I guess is the subtitle. It's written by Christopher Levan. He's a minister at College Street United in Toronto. He relates the story of when he's a child, he breaks his sister's favorite doll. Can you imagine? Yeah, happened to me. Yeah. So breaks his sister's favorite doll. So his mother marches him up by the arm to his sister's room and says, okay, tell her you're sorry. And he's like, I'm sorry. And so then the sister says, okay, he's sorry. You tell him you forgive him. I forgive you. Okay, it's all good. And off we go. Is that the real deal? Yeah, no. Well, he doesn't come down on it like that's the wrong thing. In this article, he says, it's kind of the pattern, that they're teaching their kids the pattern of something that's healthy in relationships, whether they get it or not. So I suppose, to me, the difference would be that's the pattern and the right thing to do, but he may not be actually forgiving, she may not be forgiving from her heart yet, right? And then he writes this, as adults, we know forgiveness to be one of the most perplexing human emotions. On the one hand, we cannot manufacture forgiveness at will. It is a spiritual miracle that comes to our hearts from another realm. Someone hurts us and the injury stings for some time. Then one morning we wake and it no longer has the same grip on us. So I thought that was an interesting way to put something. Kind of when he says, but forgiving from the heart, well, how do you do that? And he says, it is a spiritual miracle that comes to our hearts from another realm. That's pretty much it. It's just the mercy of God, the grace of God at work in our lives and in our hearts, that we have the capacity and the wherewithal to forgive somebody. So then he goes on to to give an example, a relatively recent example, from 2009, actually, of the story of Dr. Izzeldin Abuelaish, who's a Palestinian doctor. So he was the first Palestinian doctor to work in a hospital in Israel. And he came home one day, and a shell from an Israeli tank went into his house and killed 3 of his daughters and his niece. And he had been doing a television show of some kind and been going on television. It says here, and yet that night he went on national television declaring, I shall not hate. This is a Palestinian who lives in Gaza who got his family half destroyed by an Israeli shell. So just the death of his children, rather than provoking animosity and vengeance, led him to promote new pathways for peace and forgiveness between Palestinians and Israelis. And he actually is one of the influencers today. He actually moved to Canada, and he's a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto today. He's about a year older than I am. Sure, he's 62, fine. And and so he's a mover and shaker for peace between Israel and Palestine. And he's got something. He's coming from a place where people can't say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about," because he definitely does know what he's talking about. And he knows that the path to peace is not in hate. So he actually wrote a book by that name, which is I Shall Not Hate. Another great story. So it's likely that we're all pretty good at forgiving, right? We can't have got this far in life without it. You have to forgive, once you start school, right? And kids start to get at you on the playground. You're kind of protected till you start going to school. And the kids on the playground, it's a tough shock to the system. Things happen. So you have to learn to deal with it, let it go, forgive. Then as you gather more friends and you have friendships, you get hurt. You start a job, I won't even start. The things that happen in the workplace. You get married, you have a spouse, you have children. There's a lot of room for a need for forgiveness just to get through life. And, your parents too. All those things. And most of the time, it's not such a big deal, the things that we forgive on a fairly regular basis. Like you're on the freeway and somebody cuts you off, right? Or somebody left the toilet seat up, right? Or you went to the Independent to get some gas and you sat there gently waiting for your turn to get it, and somebody just jumps right in front of you and goes, oh, eh? Or dog things. We're dog people now. I've become a dog person in my daughter-ing years here. And so I'm always dealing with dogs and thinking about dogs, and I'm more aware of the things about dogs. So you take your dog to the park, say, and you're on leash, and somebody's there with their dog not on leash, because my dog is so good, it never does anything to anybody. Oh, yeah. Or people that don't pick up their doggy doo-doo, stuff like that. So we, little annoying things that you have to forgive to carry on. But sometimes we just can't seem to get past something, right? Sometimes harsh things are said, there's a rift, we don't talk it out, years pass, and that hurt can become part of us, built right in. I've told this story before, I'll tell you again, but when I was in Rod 25 years ago, before I came to Halliburton, in the church where I served, there were two sisters who would not speak to each other. One sat on that side of the church, and the other one sat on this side of the church. And I never found out I never did know. I just knew that they wouldn't speak to each other. Something had happened sometime. As far as I know, they never did speak to each other. But they both came to church fairly regularly. Very strange, right? It happens. And we all know somebody that sort of thing has happened to, and that might be us. But all the situations I know of kind of pale in comparison with just the examples that we just read about Robert Rule and Gary Ridgway, who killed his daughter, or Immaculée, whose family was slaughtered, and so on. I mean, stories like that. But that doesn't mean it's an easy thing for us, even if we do that comparison. And this is where we need to look carefully at the cross. Because the cross is the crux of the matter, if you will. The cross of Christ, and I've been preaching about the cross of Christ for many, many years, and I've yet to understand it or comprehend it. It's just beyond our comprehension. It's a historical event, but the meaning of it is cosmic and so powerful and so profound that it's hard to get our heads around it. And the understanding of the early Christians actually came from probably the Old Testament. So, for instance, remember the story about David? David has a guy killed so he can marry his wife, Bathsheba, and then he gets confronted by the prophet. And then he writes this psalm, and part of the psalm is, "Against you, Lord, and you only have I sinned, and done that which is wrong in your sight." It's part of the understanding of the early church and the early Christians was, we can do terrible things to one another, but in the end, it's actually against the God of those people, the one who loves them the most, who made them. So when we sin, when we hurt each other, we're actually hurting God. We're actually, our greatest misdeed is against the one who made them and loves them and holds them as dear. So that's part of it. And then Isaiah 53, that great passage where it says, and this is quoted quite a bit in the New Testament, it says, "He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities." And that's how they understood what had happened to Jesus. When Paul starts to write to the various churches and to teach them, the basics of this, so Romans is basically the basic teaching of this. He writes in Romans 3, "There is no difference. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented him as a sacrifice of atonement," that's at the cross, "through faith in his blood." And at the end of the next chapter, he just says, "He was delivered over to death for our sins and was raised to life for our justification." Every last one of us. Same boat, same need. So, it's often only in the light of that, the understanding of the cost of our forgiveness, that we are able to forgive. We're to understand how much we're forgiven and grow in that understanding as life goes by, and then compare that to the things that are happening to us and forgive. It's also built into the Lord's Prayer, right? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. There's this correlation between our forgiveness and us forgiving others. And this parable is given by Jesus to really hammer that point home. No matter what has happened to us, what someone has done to us, comparatively, we are like the servant that went out and took his fellow servant by the throat and choked him and threw him in prison, compared to what's being forgiven us. We're learning to forgive, right? I assume. It's an ongoing process. We're learning to love. That's what we're about. In the world to come, there will be no hostility or hatred or war, and I expect we all plan to be part of that world, right? So that's our hope, our expectation. We hope to be part of God's kingdom, the kingdom of peace, a kingdom of shalom, where things are in harmony. So Christ has called us to practice it in the here and now, to be part of that prototype society. That's also known as the Church of Jesus Christ. And our practicing of this influences the world around us, even as the examples we've heard and read today have done. So what a better world this would be if there was forgiveness instead of bitterness, forgiveness instead of vengeance, and forgiveness instead of violence. May it be so. Shall we pray?